Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to a special live edition of Everything Compliance. Today, we're going to take up the imbroglio surrounding the Bank of America and their work hour scandal, not the 2013 work hour scandal, the 2024 work hour scandal. Story was broken by some great reporting in the Wall Street Journal. Matt is going to set the stage for us and lead us off today, Matt. So, can you give us the background to this story?
Sure, Tom. Unfortunately, you are correct that this is not the 2013 scandal. It's not even really the 2024 scandal. It is the decade-long scandal that Bank of America has been struggling with here of junior bankers in their investment banking division who are working too many hours. This is just, frankly, a white-collar slave shop, which is not uncommon in some high-pressure environments, such as investment banking. That doesn't mean it's good. And what brought everything to a head recently was the death of one of these junior bankers who worked for Bank of America. He was 35 years old, a man named Leo Lukinas, who is a former Green Beret and left behind a wife and two young children. But he had been working more than 100 hours a week for weeks on end, helping Bank of America to close a major acquisition, which it did in May. And they all went out to a celebratory dinner. And later on that night, Mr. Lucanis died of a blood clot in his coronary artery. Now, we cannot directly attribute his death to his working 100 or 120 hours a week for weeks on end, but I'm sure that didn't help. And so Bank of America and other Wall Street banks then did the requisite soul searching about how terrible this is. And the Wall Street Journal did some great reporting about how pervasive this is. And they documented really like a enterprise-wide failure of corporate culture here, that there were former employees in the investment banking division at Bank of America, but they had been quitting because of overwork in New York, in London, in Tokyo, in Latin America, and financial centers. This was not a point-specific, office-specific problem. This was an enterprise-wide failure of corporate culture. And then what really got me thinking about this was that, as you referenced, Tom, this is not the first time Bank of America has had an employee die after working 100 hours a week for weeks on end. This happened in 2013 with a intern in its London office who had done the same sort of white collar sweatshop labor. And then he also died of a heart condition when he was, I think he was even younger than that, in his 20s. So back then in 2013, Bank of America said it would institute policies to alleviate this overwork crisis. And 10 years later, it turns out, according to the Wall Street Journal, those policies and internal controls have not worked. The policy is that if you are working more than 80 hours a week, you must first get approval from HR, who will discuss the need for this with your manager. And so it turns out that a lot of managers at Bank of America just told their overworked subordinate employees, don't report your hours to HR at all. But what fascinated me is that this is a clear corporate culture problem. This was known by senior management, middle management, lower management who are working the 100 hours a week. And it's been known for years. And the policies they have in place haven't worked to cure the problem. I think that is a dynamic that any compliance officer from any industry could appreciate. And what really got me about this, Tom, is that the senior bankers, the senior executives at Bank of America say they don't want overwork. Clearly, the junior bankers do not want to overwork either, because working 120 hours a week is nobody's idea of a good time. Doesn't matter how much money you make if you're always at your desk. So the top and the bottom really were in alignment that this is a culture problem we need to fix. And I was more curious, okay, why didn't it get fixed? Because that is the real abstract issue that any compliance officer would want to understand. And yes, it's middle management. We always say middle management is the problem at any large dysfunctional organization. But why? What specifically was middle management doing? And there was one detail in one of these Wall Street Journal articles that really drove home for me where this dysfunction happens, is that after the first recent expose, hit the news and everybody was shocked. The lower bankers started telling reporters, oh, now my middle managers say that they do want me to report all of the hours I'm working because senior management is now telling them this is important. No kidding. I mean, that's the thing. When we all say that middle management is where corporate culture lives and dies, yes, that's true at the simple level, but it is more complicated than that. It is very specifically, how does senior management engage with middle management? Because middle managers are only going to do what the boss tells them. And they somehow got it into their heads that, yes, we have these policies and controls against overwork, but we shouldn't be taking them seriously because we're a win organization. Right up until it hit the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And then senior managers said, knock this off. Lo and behold, middle management is now running around telling junior bankers, knock this off. Report your extra hours. Don't work 100 hours a week. And it is a refreshing, arresting reminder of how much senior management does really have to get into the thick of managing corporate culture, reach right in, deal with middle management and explain to them in very clear terms what is important, give them incentives for what is really important. And if it's not overwork, you have to give them some sort of incentive against overwork. You have to give them some sort of incentive not to tell the employees, just disregard policy, don't tell anybody. That's where you need to really think about, is senior management engaging with middle management the right way? And once they do, and middle management knows what's important, they're just going to do it because that's all they do, is they just do what senior management tells you. And it was striking to see this dysfunction and how Bank of America is fumbling to try and address it. And maybe they'll do it, but why start now? Because they haven't done it for the last decade. They haven't pulled it off.
So, any questions or comments for Matt? Jonathan Marks.
I think what Matt has laid out is certainly a detailed and in-depth description of what happened. But I go back and I look at what happened. Oh gosh, Merrill Lynch in 2000, in the early 2000s, maybe mid 2000s. Look at Barclays or look at Goldman Sachs. You look at the industry and just say to yourself, scratch your head. This is a high stakes environment, and the cultural norms which have probably existed before all of us even existed are there, very difficult to break. I think more importantly, the thing that really eats me away, Matt, and I wanted your thoughts on this is that, and I think you actually did mention this, but there's really five enemies of internal control. We talk about internal control. There's also another enemy that just is disastrous that keeps rearing its ugly head, and that is those incentive structures and the incentive comp that's
Yeah.
tied to these individuals and forcing them to work the 100 hours. And, you're right. I mean, but I look at this and I say, okay, root cause, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, the three monkeys. And there's just a lack of monitoring, or there's just this privately thought of wave that's running through these organizations. It's like, which existed when I was young and in business. You're going to get the job done at all costs. I don't care if you work 100 hours, 150 hours, sleep on the couch and shower in the gym downstairs. These deals are going to get done, and whatever happens. And nobody really cares about you as a human being.
I mean, I thought about that a lot, actually, is what are the incentives and the messages that senior management is sending to middle management? Because I am sure in these intervening 10 years between death one and death two, yes, I bet senior management did say to middle management, don't make the junior bankers work literally them into an early grave. We don't want that. But saying the words is one thing. What are you actually giving the middle managers real incentive to do? And clearly there was not enough real incentive to not have the junior bankers work themselves into an early grave, because at least two of them have. And many others were saying that they quit because of mental health reasons or they just couldn't take it. And I think a lot about middle managers saying, oh, this is what we did when I was their age. I did it. I'm still here. And so we're going to do it. I That's not really a good answer. And look, I was a newspaper reporter for 5 years. I think my record was I worked 20 hours straight in one big story. And I'm not afraid of long, hard work to some extent, but long, hard work to a full all extent is not a good thing. And really, if we're going to have senior executives and the board in charge of corporate culture, that's what this means. They actually have to step forward and tell middle managers, I don't care. That's how you did it when you were their age. This is a different age now, and we're going to do things differently. And for whatever reason, senior managers across Wall Street are not conveying that message with the proper urgency or effectiveness to the middle ranks. And that's why this overwork problem is rampant.
Their incentive compensation is tied to getting the deal done too, is it?
It is, yes. And I mean, think through how might they change all of that? Really, this $2 billion acquisition that the Mr. Lucanus was working on before he died, was it really going to be so important that it be done in the month of May compared to June? Could he have worked maybe just 90 hours a week and still be around and the deal got closed 3 weeks later instead? A lot of this overwork, really, it's just being physically present so that you can proofread a PowerPoint for the 19th time and move around a couple of commas and periods and then put it on desks of other middle managers who aren't even going to read it. Has anybody thought to revisit that process? Has anybody thought about using generative AI to come up with these things? There are going to be ways to alleviate that overwork burden if that's something that is important to the company to do. Some of it technology, some of it process, some of it just defining down some of your performance goals, because 100 years from now, everybody's going to be dead, even if you work 2 hours a week. And is anybody then going to care that you work that hard right now? It sounds a bit corny, but it certainly matters. And, like, tell somebody like Mr. Lucanus' widow and children that these things really were so urgent. Sometimes these corny life is short messages are important indeed. I bet it's important to them.
Right. And just one last comment here. It's not indicative of banking. It's indicative of any organization that has deals they're up against deadlines. I mean, I go back and look at the industry that I'm in, and I can tell you that when I was a kid, I get a memo from our managing partner saying that everyone was to work 85 hours this week or you're in trouble.
Karen, what do you have a big smile on your face? But I think that
I
means
mean,
you have a comment or question.
I do. I think all this is spot on. I don't know if it's take issue with Matt's comment about this being from senior management. I think that is inherently entirely true. I do think it's industry wide, but the pressure, it comes from clients. Like, clients are expecting you to get this done. So it's not simply just that is the zeitgeist of Wall Street and big law and all these places we've seen. But there is also this consumer problem of the clients are expecting that too. So there's pressure, not just for the sake of pressure, but there's pressure that comes from even before we get to these certain firms. So I don't think that excuses senior management or the culture they've created, but it's not sort of sui generis just because you happen to be at Goldman or Bank of America.
No, but it is a sign of like poor management of client expectations that, we're going to make this deadline for you, even if we have to kill somebody. Apparently that was the case at Bank of America. Like, ultimately, I don't really love holding senior executives to the fire for all things at all times, but this is one of those situations where that's the job. Senior management is to guide all of these stakeholders to realistic expectations about what's possible and what's ethically moral. And I don't think Ms. Lucanus is that sympathetic to a client expecting a deal to be closed in the month of May or whatever the details were.
Karen Moore.
Yeah, I just want to say this is so 90s to me, that this whole you have to be there, leave your jacket on the back of your chair, just reminds me of kind of early law firm days for me, where there was a kind of a sign of joining the club to put in not just billable hours, but face time. Just seems to me in this day and age, when there's so much conversation about mental health and psychological safety, that hours for the sake of hours, just not just the pressure of the client or getting a deal done, it's a kind of stupid way to run your business.
Oh, on that note, Jonathan Marks, I've asked you to consider this from the internal controls perspective. And I first want to be fair that this was not an internal control override. This was not doing the internal control. And what do you say to this situation as our resident internal controls expert?
I think everyone kind of danced around this a little bit, but they didn't really get into sort of the realm of controls. So if you look at it from a control perspective, obviously the control environment is something that we definitely take a look at. And then you look at if you synthesize the comments, if it's senior management, it's tone from the top, right? And that tone resonates down and through the organization. And when things are not remediated or things are not taken care of, those weaknesses could rise to a level of pretty large significance. And even they could be classified as material weaknesses in the realm of internal controls. And organizations that don't take remediation seriously or don't have a plan for remediation, it's been written before that you can have these weaknesses or these gaps in your controls, but they can rise to a level of significance to the point where there is no control environment. And there are organizations out there that have gotten in trouble for not necessarily having a robust control environment. And it's been pointed out. And I think in going outside the banking realm and looking at this from a control perspective, there are certainly companies and organizations out there that may have same or similar or parallel issues when it comes to controls. But this is something where I think we look at all the time. And I'm curious to everybody else's comments on the panel today, because I see this in practice and I'm sure you all hear about it and read about it and see it too. But it comes to the point where if you're identifying these weaknesses or these gaps and there is no remediation, a lot of times I think we're too soft on organizations. And I think there's a bigger message in there. And I think the bigger message is, hey, maybe we just don't care about the control environment, or there's a reason why we're leaving the control environment soft, and that is to perpetrate unethical behavior. But for me, when I see this, it sort of screamed to me an engagement that I was on way back when, where there were basically senior leadership, every type of control opportunity that they had, they turned away. And they actually got a material weakness in their report to the FCC with regards to this. And it basically says that the tone at the top was basically that toxic and that there was no control environment because they failed to recognize internal controls or failed to remediate identified and recognize weaknesses. And so I'm not so sure. I don't know that the situation that we're talking about today from 2013 to 2024, I don't know what happened in between there, whether there was, I think Matt, you had mentioned there may have been some type of remediation put forth, but then it kind of went backwards. And I think that's really, again, I'd be interested to hear everybody else's comments here, but that's really what this is all about. We talked about it's not a set it and forget it environment. Culture is something that you have to work on, but it's something that leaders need to be cognizant of. And when you have to take these clues, like constantly use that feedback in order to keep that machine going. But it does take a lot of work. And I do think from an overall banking perspective, there are so many issues with regards to institutions like the one that you're talking about and other institutions with regards to transactions and systems and data and things like that, that sometimes these things get pushed to the side or put them in a parking lot over there. We'll get to them. And I don't think you could do that anymore. I just don't. I think the human in the loop issues that we're talking about today, we've talked about in other sessions, they're real. And if you're not gonna deal with them, you're gonna get a situation like this where this poor guy lost his life, maybe unnecessarily. I don't really know. Maybe there was some inherent issue with him and he passed unexpectedly and he would have passed whether he worked 100 hours or not. But regardless of that, it's just the whole thing is just ridiculous. And it's much like any organization that doesn't remediate their controls, if there's not a good reason why, that should be looked at more seriously. And I think that there's a gap. I know Taryn Woody, when we were talking about Caremark cases before, we were talking about governance. It seemed like DOJ, maybe, I don't know if I'm recalling this correctly, but those folks were stopping short about, or even the FCC were stopping short about mentioning these governance failures. To me, it's really a governance failure. I mean, your failure to monitor, and things like that. But that really goes towards the control environment. And I haven't seen too much discussion about that lately. So I'll stop here.
So, Jonathan, how would you characterize the design of a control where the control is self-reporting by the person to be controlled? Is that an effective control? Because here you had the junior bankers and the interns having to enter their time or input how much time they had spent. Is that an effective control?
I think it's part of the control, but I also think it has to be monitored. It's not just the reporting of time. If nobody's monitoring this, I remember one time somebody told me, it's like management by walking around. We don't walk around anymore. We don't see people. This COVID thing with this remote environment, I think actually destroyed individuals because they wound up working 5 times harder than they could have. If they were in an office and somebody saw them sitting there at 11 o'clock at night with the lights on, they might have sent them home. I don't, Again, I don't know what happened in the situation that we're talking about, whether this was a remote worker or he was there. I have no idea, but it's an interesting question, and I'm not so sure I have a great answer.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Jonathan?
I have a comment about the internal controls because I do think there were some nuts and bolts basics here that I am still puzzled by. Let's remember Bank of America is a large, sophisticated, well-funded business. They can do a lot of things if they so choose. And yet, Tom, as you alluded there, the control against overwork was this self-reporting by employees of how many hours they worked. So the managers were just saying, don't report how many hours you work. I don't get that. In modern times, why couldn't Bank of America automate at least some of tracking employees' hours? I mean, at a large law firm, which is not that different from a large investment banker with overwork problems and young staff, a large law firm these days, they have software that can track how many times the associates blink their eyes so that you can build a client. And really, you couldn't implement something like that to monitor how much are the junior bankers actually using their computers? How much are they typing away on their keys? Because that software exists. Kind of creepy to me, but in financial services, employee surveillance is not anything new, and it's not a big deal to be intrusive. Or could you compare what are people complaining about to HR? What are they complaining about in their interviews? What are they complaining about on the internal hotline? And we have these overwork issues coming up in the hotline. But when we look at the self-reporting of overwork, we don't have any records of that. And that doesn't make any sense. I mean, nobody's investigating that. And that went on for 10 years. And it looks from the journal's reports that these threads were not pulled on, or the investment to automate the controls and make them stronger like that didn't happen. And if it was a investment bank with 3 people out in Bayonne, New Jersey, maybe I'd give them some slack, but this is not that. This is Bank of America. This is one of the largest organizations in the world, and they didn't do it. So that was puzzling to me.
But Matt, a lot of the technology piece isn't hard. They will almost certainly have been using Microsoft systems. Microsoft Teams, for example, has that type of telemetry data built in. Now, obviously, you've got privacy concerns, you've got data protection concerns, you've got lawful business practice regulations concerns for UK-based employees. But provided you've got a decent reason for it, that technology exists out of the box in a lot of Microsoft systems. So it's not a question of can't do it. It might be a question of didn't want to do it. It might be a question of didn't think to do it, but can't do it isn't the answer.
Yeah. I think
Don't forget it goes both ways. It identifies the people that are outliers from an hours perspective, and it identifies people that are the outliers from not working as hard as they probably should have.
Correct. And I guess if somebody didn't turn up in the office on their allocated day, they'd be using the door entry system to discipline them and print out and show them the days that they didn't turn up. We need to do that. If they were office-based, we've got the same systems that say somebody clocked in at 6 a.m, didn't leave till midnight. You can interrogate those systems as well.
I think it goes back to the fact that we're living in this hybrid or remote environment. If you're walking around, you can see whether somebody's dragging, they're not feeling good. They're there or someone would say to you, hey, Armstrong was here till 11:30 at night for the last 6 weeks. What's he doing? What's he working on? He looks exhausted. Maybe somebody should go talk to him. We don't have that anymore. We don't. For most of us, we don't have that anymore. So, I mean, by the way, my computer's on all the time. And at 11 o'clock at night, maybe if I'm walking downstairs to get a glass of water, I may go and check an email or two. I mean, does that mean that I'm working? I don't know. Or I'm checking to see what crazy message Tom Fox sends me. on my computer. But I don't know that there's anything perfect. He goes back to fundamentally, it's that culture. But if people believe that they're doing the best they possibly can and they could work 40 hours a week or 35 hours a week or whatever the expectation is, and they're working more and nobody recognizes the fact that they're working more, maybe they're working more. Maybe this guy was a dingaling and he didn't know what he was doing. So he had to work 3 times harder than everybody else in order to get what he needed to get in order to get the deal done. I hated this girl in high school because I'd spend 18 hours studying for a math test. She'd study for 3 minutes. She'd get an A. I would get an A too, but I'm like, how come she gets it and I don't? I mean, there's all these variables.
Jonathan, it's time to leave that behind, matey.
I know.
On that note, Karen Moore, do you have a question or comment for Mr. Marks?
I am going to defer to Karen Woody, who I think laid claim to question. But yeah, I'll just make one comment there, which is work is work. And in the junior banking, just like in junior law firm associates, there's work that needs to be done. The question is really does this work need to be done? And does it need to be done on a constant basis like that? That just is crazy. Somebody told me once, there's never a question of you don't have enough time. It's either you're not managing your time or there are not enough people to do the work. The scope of the work is too big.
Karen Woody, what do you have for us?
It echoes a lot of what Matt was saying. And my first thought was, in terms of internal controls, is what is the data we have? Like, how do we have some subset of something to monitor? And what struck me in the first Wall Street Journal article was that I think, maybe I'm wrong about this, but in the investment banking space, it seemed that the metric is just to get the deal done. And I say that vis-a-vis in a law firm, it was how many hours have you worked? That is the metric. You put your hours down. And to your point, Tom, sometimes that's garbage in, garbage out, because whether someone is underinflating, usually they're overinflating that, because that is the one-to-one of how you get compensated is how many hours you can show you worked. But it sounds like investment banking, they're kind of doing the opposite. And they're sort of trying to decrease the hours number so they didn't get flagged by HR. But at the end of the day, the metric, the thing you care about is getting the deal done. So in that sense, I think that what you're watching is a little different than I think at least my experience of it. And I think that's right about it. There are ways to actually know how much people are working, at least even 10-ish years ago when I was still a law firm. There are ways to see what programs you're on, if you are running, especially junior people. If you're looking at a doc review, you're in a software system that is tracking your keystrokes or how many documents you've looked at in a minute, because we start measuring that too, especially if you have an army of contract attorneys. That stuff is all measurable. And so I think when you have more data, it sounds like the data set might be a little different for the investment bank because they just need you to get stuff done. But there should be ways to track actual employee hours, I would say.
I think Karen Woody raises a very good point that yes, law firms, they're similar in overwork, but very different in what their metrics are for success. Going back to investment banking, let's say the metric is how many deals are we closing? That is a metric for business success. And that's not actually the risk that we're talking about here. The risk we're talking about is our employees working 120 hours a week and being miserable and dropping like flies. And that is, you would have different metrics that you'd want to look at to see, is that happening? You can do two of these metrics at the same time if senior management declares that overwork is a risk that we want to monitor and investigate. If senior management says this is a thing that we want to figure out, middle management will figure it out because that's what they're paid to do, is what senior management tells them. And I guess my question for Bank of America and really any large bank is, or any large organization, are you thinking about the right sort of corporate culture risks? And have you defined them and declared that they're important? Because once you've done that, then you can start reverse engineering. So what are the sort of metrics we should be looking at and studying, and what data do we have to see if this is a problem or not? And you can do all of that while still having a whole separate set of performance metrics for, is the business making money? And whether that's hours worked with your associate law firm or business deals being closed by the Bank of America or an investment bank, they're two separate tracks. And looks like Bank of America was only obsessing over one and not the corporate culture one.
All right, Karen Moore, I've asked you to consider this from the board of directors perspective. And I would start off by saying junior bankers an intern's timesheet are not something I would think would get on the board radar. But yet here we had literally above the fold on the Wall Street Journal, a very troubling, if not damning article. You're at the board or you're brought in and asked to guide the board through this. What do you start with and what do you tell them?
Yeah, I struggled with this, Tom, because we had over time very clear message that the board is entitled to rely on management representation. We talked about that, I think, last time in the most recent Caremark case with Centene, where the court declined to hold the board accountable on the basis that there were representations made by management that things were known, they were being taken care of, and they could even be reported on. So I kind of struggled with where does the board go beyond that? How much demand do they make for follow up? And I would say, as a rule, maybe on this topic, even when you have two deaths 10 years apart, that maybe the board isn't on sufficient notice that there's an issue that requires their oversight supervision at that level. However, do think that the whole idea of the company culture and the way the company operates and the way its employees are being treated is an area where there is such a disconnect so often between the board and the company that they're supposed to be responsible for. I don't want to slam all boards, and I know I'm going into stereotypes here, but if you have board meetings that are being held in Paris or in a luxury Miami country club, and the only company employees that, as a board member, you ever come into contact with are those people that are presenting to the board and have been coached and prepped and don't disrupt the board. The board is treated with this really, what I find, very unacceptable reverence. I do kind of lay the blame at the feet of boards that are like that, that never go into the head office, let alone outposts, that never sit down in a bank's case with a bunch of junior bankers to say, hey, how's it going? How do you feel we're doing as a bank? What could we do better? How are you being treated? What do we as a board need to know? And so I don't know that there's a legal duty of inquiry there, but I think there's something that's beyond a moral duty of inquiry for boards to get a little closer to the business and get a little more of the flavor beyond the numbers, beyond management reassurances. And I would hope that the death of a young man with a promising career is something that might wake a board up to that beyond demanding controls and metrics and things that maybe they're not directly accountable for.
Karen, do you bring in the head of HR? Do you bring in a multi or cross-functional team of senior execs to talk to the board? The board has to do something. Do they appoint a special committee? Do they have the head of the board asset for compliance as the head of audit? How would you think through or help them think through structuring, responding to this problem on a go forward basis?
I'd like to see more of kind of permissible speak up culture around this topic within the organization so that people who feel like the policy says X and we're doing Y, in almost every other case, people might speak up and file a complaint. And that should, in the normal course of reporting into the board, start highlighting a trend that there are increasing complaints about our workplace environment, our workplace culture, our ability to adhere to reasonable work hours and expectations. And at that point, then I think the board maybe is on notice of a much bigger problem. I'm really curious to hear what others have to say on that.
Then what I wanted to now ask you, Karen, was Jonathan Marks talked about a root cause analysis. Sh- I don't want to say could, but should the board then use this example of lack of information, lack of following internal controls to perhaps look at other areas or explore other areas? Or is that not the function of the board?
Yeah, I think when you have something as serious as a death, right? It's not theft of product or kind of some sort of a mismanagement. That there are all sorts of opportunities for the board to say this is not a one-off issue. This is a warning for us, something that maybe we should appoint some sort of a commission to look into further. I don't know how this was communicated and how much it was communicated as a standalone um, incident or the potential of the tip of an iceberg. I don't know how the board received that and how they perceived that and how they responded to it.
All right. Well, Karen Woody, I ask you to think about this perhaps a little bit different light. You have, as you mentioned, you have worked in big law. You moved to the university environment, but I know you've worked on large projects. I know you've worked on enforcement actions. Everyone, I think, on this panel has at some point in their career worked lots of hours. Matt talked about writing on deadline, writing in the middle of big projects, having to work long and hard hours. So that's not something that's unusual for at least the people on this panel. But how does a university or a law school think about communicating this type of information, or a business school? Is this something that a law school or business school needs to make their students aware of? Or is this just a part of the hazing process?
I know we don't want to use the word hazing. I don't even know if I would use the word hazing because it goes back to what I was saying to Matt a little bit earlier about where the pressure is coming from. Some of that's external, some that certainly is internal from your bosses. But I mean, I'm going to toss out there that some of this is also just self-selected. I mean, so I will give an example or an anecdote. I worked for two large New York firms. I was in the DC office of those, so I wasn't in the Death Star exactly. I was in the satellite of sorts, and a lot of my work dealt with regulators. So I was with DOJ or SEC, which is obviously a different set of hours than people doing deals and across the table or sitting next to some of these investment bankers. So I had a little bit of a different stripe in my experience. But I will say there was one year where the firm brought in McKinsey or somebody, and I'm sure they billed us $1 billion, but just to tell us, hey, I actually think the most effective thing you can do is to remove your hours requirement. We had a 2,000 hours requirement to make your bonus. And so they said, actually, no hours requirement for next year, which was sort of unheard of because there's some of us who are like, all right, I don't have to come to work. I'm still going to get a bonus. But McKinsey had shown, and I think it bore out, that people then overbilled. People were now billing 2,200 because they're competing a little bit against themselves. I think this was trying to push back again when people hit their hours in October and then just coasted the rest of the year. There was this sort of psychology behind this. And I say that just because some of this is just the pressure of people coming out of business schools and law schools into a super competitive space, super competitive jobs. And if I was not told, I certainly had the sense that there are 15 people outside trying to get your job. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to stay late? Are you not? And I do think that is obviously a cultural impression, but then some of that really is just these very type A motivated people who, if you tell them, go home, you're done, some of them might get back on and try to go the extra yard. I hope that's not the case, but I think there's some truth to that being, like I said, the self-selected group of people that are entering in this. And why do they do that? Because there's so much money involved in these places. These people are making so much money. There's such a promise of so much money. I don't know if the solution then is to reduce the incentive structures for them to make them not work as hard. I mean, it's a tricky conundrum, I think, to be in. And like I say, I'm speaking entirely from my experience in the law firm. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a little bit of a different stripe in investment banking, as we said, discussing the metrics maybe being a little different. But I only throw that out there as sort of to get people discussing. Sometimes this is just very intense set of people working for a very intense set of people. How do you change that culture writ large? It's tricky.
Karen Moore, do you have a comment or question for Karen Woody?
Yeah, just quick comment coming out of a similar law firm culture and really being a very deals based lawyer in the M&A space. Sometimes it was simply a badge of honor as an associate to be working all night and get some work product, or to be in a deal room, or to even be at the printers proofreading in early days on an IPO. Sometimes I think it becomes self-generated and a self-fulfilling prophecy that the associates put out there as well. And I just question the efficiency after hour 10 of how your brain is functioning and what kind of actual work product you're putting out there. Like I said, I think it's a really
On that note, let's go across the pond to our former colonial overlord, Mr. Armstrong. What
Well,
what observations do you have on all this? Recognizing once again that you came out of a law firm world, so you have some experience, and certainly in your GDPR life, you understand what it means to have all hands on board in the middle of an emergency.
Yeah, correct. And I think there's still, obviously, I've moved back into a slightly more conventional law firm, and I think there are still all sorts of challenges. I mean, to Karen's point, we, at my last firm, my current firm, we don't have billable hours targets. My experience is the opposite. I think it makes people care more about results and care less about just ramping up the hours. I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think we deliver better service at a more reasonable rate. But I don't want to sound like an advertorial. I think that law firms are definitely part of the problem. Europe's tried to address the working hours culture by having a maximum working week of 48 hours. But law firms commonly ask their staff for waivers. I imagine banks do as well. And I know that whilst 48 hours is the maximum, I know that some US law firms in London, from what I hear, have 52 hours billable as a minimum. So the statutory maximum is 48. Their minimum billable is 52. If you say that 52 hours billable is a minimum, you're probably looking at 65 to 70 hours a week in, week out, by the time you've done your training and your billing and your contribution to BD, etc. And I think there's a difference between, I'm in the middle of an investigation at the moment, I'm working fairly long hours, but I know that will end. I don't know that it'll end next week or 2 weeks' time or 3 weeks' time, but there will be a pattern where the hours will drop off. And I know a very wise, sage lawyer, shout out to him, Mr. John Grayston. I think, Tom, you maybe met him. He always said everyone can work the hours. The real key is the people who can do their hours and then rest and recover, knowing that it's going to come back again. So what we're not good at, particularly with junior lawyers, is making sure that people refresh and they're ready to go again. And I think that's part of the difference, perhaps, between law firms and banks. I think they're always churning. And I think anybody can do, hours for 1 week or 2 weeks. It's when it becomes perpetual and expected that it's a problem. And I agree that it's not just limited to bankers. And I think tone at the top is important. I was professionally involved in the junior doctors district in the UK, where it was a fight between the doctors and the then UK government over hours worked. And not only was there a state of denial from some senior members of the government at the time, but almost an aggression. We're not going to tell you the hours you're working when you submit your timesheets. Why would you not let the people working those hours see the metrics on how much they're being sweated? The trade union movement in the UK reckons that every year, £25.5 billion worth of time is taken from employees as effectively unpaid overtime. So I think that shows that it's not an issue that's limited to banking. And clearly, there are attempts now by the new government and across Europe to address this. So the real trend at the moment, we talked about it briefly on calls before, is this right to disconnect. Again, to Jonathan Marks's point about COVID has changed things, and employees are expected to be always on for their employer. Traditionally, US corporations have been regarded as the worst offenders because obviously quite often management in the US will want a clean desk policy. They'll push stuff off their desk at 5 p.m. on a Friday, which means that it lands on the desk of the person who reports to them in Germany at 11 p.m. on a Friday and wrecks their weekend for the US executive to have a a clean and relaxed one. And as a result, there's been works council activity in places like Germany, as well as legislation that's brought in regulations that say that you can't force employees to answer emails whilst outside of their working hours or on weekends. And again, US corporations, in some respects, are struggling with that legislation. The new Labour government plans to introduce something similar. We're a bit fuzzy on what that means at the moment. The assumption seems to be that ACAS, this sort of mediation body, if you like, between employers and employees, are going to produce a code that employers will be expected to follow. But to Matt's point about turn from the top, of course, we've had this quite public debate over Keir Starmer talking about his own working hours, about saying that he intends wherever possible and wherever there's not a crisis to take a proper weekend, to stop at 5 p.m. on a Friday and do urgent work only, because he says that he has family commitments that he intends to keep up. And not to make any point of this, he's quite properly disclosed a list of gifts and entertainment that he has had recently. And let's just say, looking through the gifts and the hospitality, we know that he's going to soccer matches on a regular basis. And we know that soccer clubs are kind enough to entertain him when he goes to see his beloved Arsenal on their travels. So I think there are signs at a governmental level that there's an attempt to address this. But as Jonathan Mark says, if you're not measuring those things, then there are difficulties with that as well. There are, in the Working Time Directive, this 48-hour week requirement, there are some requirements to keep records on working hours, but they're somewhat weak. And of course, why should compliance officers care about all of this? Karen Moore's given a hint of, as a general rule, employees that think that the bargain is unfair oftentimes try and even it out. And they even that out by fraud, by increasing their expense claims, by being less loyal, by being more vulnerable to scams, etc. So whenever we reduce morale by increasing hours, then we get less loyal employees and we get the potential for more compliance issues. And quite often, when I'm involved in investigations, for example, if you've got somebody who's been turned, if you like, from good to bad, sometimes there will be a trigger like that where people think that the employee-employer bargain is out of balance. So I'm going to take it in my own hands to even it out. So I don't think it's a US problem. I think it's a global problem. I don't think it's a banking problem. I think it's prevalent across many industries. And I wish I knew the solution, but at least governments over here are starting to acknowledge the problem.
All right. We are near the top of the hour and we have one or more that need to drop off. So we're going to move directly to fan favorites of shout outs and rants. We'll keep the same order. So Matt, do you have a shout out and or rant for us today?
I do have a shout out. We are recording this the day after the Democratic National Convention. And I was thinking about that and wanted to give a shout out to all of the Republican officials, because there were several who spoke at the Democratic convention, basically to say, we don't really love Kamala Harris's policies, but Donald Trump is a existential threat to the country, so we're endorsing her anyways. And that takes a lot of nerve for Republicans to do that. In a certain sense, these people are whistleblowers. They have been chased out of their jobs. They have ruined their career prospects. They have lost a lot of their friends. And that is exactly what most whistleblowers at corporate compliance programs, we talk about that sort of pressure all the time. And that is what people like former Congressman Adam Kinzinger or the former Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, whose name I believe is Robert Duncan, don't hold me to that, and several others, they all came and they all spoke to a bunch of people who would normally hate their guts. And it takes a lot of nerve and commitment for that, because these Republican whistleblowers were basically calling out the CEO of their now former organization to say this man is unfit and he is doing wrong things and he should not be in a position of leadership. If an employee was doing that at a company, we'd be holding them up as a paragon of whistleblower courage. And we should be doing the same for these folks who were at the DNC. Good for them. And if they then want to fight Kamala Harris, if she wins, that's a different story. And they can have that fight in 2025, and that's fine. But what they did today, this week, took a lot of courage. So good for them.
Jonathan Marks, you have a shout out into a rant for us.
I have a shout out, but I don't talk politics. I have a shout out to the researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, right here in the city of brotherly love, because they have developed a new, it's called the CAR-T cell therapy that has shown remarkable success in treating certain types of leukemia and lymphoma. And patients who have exhausted all of their treatment options are now achieving remission, offering new hope to cancer therapies. And I just think this is freaking remarkable. I'm not that smart to be a researcher, but for all the folks that are working on this project, kudos to you.
Can I echo that? My dad died of lymphoma.
Karen Moore, you have a shout out into a rant for us.
I sure do. I've got a shout out to my students in my Fordham Law class this term. We had our first class on Wednesday and a really vigorous discussion of shareholder primacy and stakeholder capitalism. They were fantastic. I hope they learn nearly as much as I do from these conversations. And Jonathan Armstrong, I'm just warming them up for your international compliance course.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Karen Woody.
My shout out is akin to Matt's, but my shout out is actually to whoever it is that is producing and running the event that we saw this week at the DNC. Talk about working around the clock. I assume these people haven't slept in a week, but it's been one of the most well-oiled machines in a way, and they've had to pivot on the fly. The stuff they've been able to include that clearly could have only been created and done within the last couple days. It's unbelievable. And so whoever is the event coordinator and logistic manager for this incredible event we saw this week, my shout out is to them.
Jonathan Armstrong.
Mine's slightly longer than usual, so Matt is able to leave mid-rant should you wish. When you tour Victorian stately homes in the UK, you sometimes get these embroidery things with bon mot phrases tapestried on them. And I want to start a crowdfunding campaign. In the UK, we have a phrase, keep your mouth shut and let people think you're an idiot, rather than opening your mouth and proving it. And I would like a tapestry picture of that to be put on Elon Musk's wall. I think he's certainly changed the way in which social media works, and not in a good way. I spoke on what I thought was the start of the demise of Elon Musk at the SCCE conference in Amsterdam about 18 months ago. And it's the one where I think I've had the most reaction of pro-Musk people coming up to me and saying almost that was inappropriate for a talk at a compliance conference, and how great Elon Musk was and an exemplar to the next generation. I know that at least one of those people has been kind enough to reach out afterwards and say that he was wrong. I was very interested and struck by an interview I did with the late Richard Levick, where he talked about the way in which Musk had almost duped the liberal middle class in America into thinking he was pro-environment, for example, whilst at the same time producing cars that don't have a great safety record, don't have a great environmental record, and using the credits from producing those vehicles to make profit by selling those credits to the diesel car manufacturers that he seemed to be trying to attack. And I believe it's the case that in one quarter, Tesla made more credit from selling what you would regard as poison credits than it did from manufacturing vehicles. And what's made me look at this more is the role of X, I hate to call it X, formerly known as Twitter, in the UK riots. We've had riots that have been fomented in part by X, in part by Elon Musk himself engaging, and in part, it seems, by steering the algorithm to put hate-filled messages above those of unity. As a result, we've had 1,000 arrests, and I would shout out to the new administration, since Tom invited me to earlier. They have already jailed 139 of those people, some within 72 hours. The way in which the criminal justice system has worked has been amazing to get people to trial, still a fair trial. Most of them have been guilty pleas, and into jail very quickly. That's almost certainly put a lid on riots that would have happened, but would have happened because of the role of social media in this. Now, in the UK, we have a mere conduit defense for which I think you have as Section 230, I think. So in essence, the fact that a social media platform republishes the content of others does not make the platform in itself liable. But I think we should revisit that. I think that there is, to my mind, no sense in thinking that Elon Musk here is a mere conduit. He's a player. He's taking part in the debate. So if he won't listen to the tapestry that we're crowdfunding for his wall, I think we need to revisit Section 130, revisit mere conduit, and think of making those who use social media and own social media responsible for content.
All right. So let's see if I can do this. Is Rick Springfield singing Jesse's Girl? Jesse's Girl is one of the two most sung songs from the 1980s, along 8674309. Don't lose that number. So today's Rick Springfield's birthday. And if you don't know Jesse's Girl, go listen to it. It's a great song, and you'll be singing it within the next 30 minutes. Great episode, guys. Thanks for going out on a limb and taking on some topics you don't normally think about. And I can't wait to see what we can do next time.